JD, come back anytime.
Yep. John Dammit is what his name stands for. John Dammit Vance.
Anyway, Hillbilly Elegy is essentially he calls it a, quote, memoir, and it's about JD Vance, and he tells his story about growing up with a family that is in Appalachia. He has a really hard upbringing, and essentially tells us a story about his upbringing and then correlates it to what the rest of Appalachia is, quote unquote, going through.
Yeah, and who is JD Vance, you may be asking? Well, he's just a guy, and we're going to get into that. But first, as always, what we like to do at the beginning of each episode is honor an Appalachian who's going out above and beyond the call of duty to do the good in this world, to give back to her or his community in a positive way, because we like to start these episodes out as positive, John. And that's something that we've been trying to get better at, because, you know, there's a lot of negative things that are happening with Appalachia, and certainly we want to talk about that, but got to keep it positive. So today, I'm very excited about this one. And John, I cued you in a little bit on this person prior to the show. This week's Appalachian of the Week is Yasin Teru of Knoxville, Tennessee. Yasin is a Syrian refugee who fled the war in his home country around 8 years ago, and he's the owner of Yasin's Falafel House, which is a restaurant in Knoxville. He was recently named, I think last year, by Good Morning America. His restaurant was named the nicest place in America by Good Morning America, and it's really quickly become a local symbol of the American dream there, and it's just such a... I've unfortunately never got to go there, but it's everyone that I've talked to about his restaurant it's such a warm, welcoming place, and he just really embodies like the spirit of someone who came here to make their life better. And the reason why I'm bringing up Yasin today is that, as a lot of you may know, Nashville suffered some horrendous tornadoes in the past week. In fact, it was last Sunday. And Yasin got his team together and drove down to Nashville to open up a pop-up kitchen to feed residents who were displaced by the tornadoes. So this is a guy who's got a small business, and he's embodying the American dream and everything that there is to show about community, and he's taking that and he's bringing it down to people who are really in need. And, you know, you could point to probably 100 different people, especially just associated with the recovery of the tornado in Nashville, as Appalachians of the Week. But I wanted to specifically point out Yasin because I think that he really embodies what we're trying to get at with this honor and with this designation on this show.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously only know what you told me, Chuck, and what I've read a little bit, and the things that this guy has done. He really does seem like the nicest guy in Appalachia, but I mean, especially the nicest guy in Tennessee. So I think we're all thankful and lucky to have people like him. Hopefully more people step up and help that area as they continue to rebuild.
Yeah, well, in fact, they're actually in a lot of places they have too many volunteers, which is fantastic. And I'm going to post links in the show notes just to some organizations that are doing really good work there, that are taking volunteers or that need help, that anybody who's listening to this show that's not already cued in on that can get those resources and help in any way they can. So, with that being said, Yasin, great guy, Appalachian of the Week, and, you know, what a better guy. No better guy than him to really embody that. Now, the guy that we're going to talk about with next, John, though, I don't think that he's going to probably ever get the Appalachian of the Week. I don't want to say ever. I'm a guy who never says never or ever, but I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that JD Vance is not exactly at the top of the list right now for Appalachian of the Week.
Don't you mean Appalachian?
Oh, God, you're right. Yeah. No. Well, then if we're talking Appalachian of the Week,
he's got a shot.
For sure, got a shot. Really, really gunning for it, for sure. But yeah, JD Vance and Hillbilly Elegy. John, you talked about it a little bit in the opening, but JD Vance is a guy who wrote a book that got ridiculously popular. We're going to talk a little bit about why, but JD Vance he's a Marine Corps veteran and a Yale law grad born in Middletown, Ohio. and sort of grew up there and in Jackson, Kentucky. He became the principal at a venture capital firm owned by Peter Thiel. So your typical Appalachian story of success for sure. He wrote this book that became incredibly popular and was on the New York Times bestseller list for a really long time. And it talked about his life growing up, and people took it as sort of a handbook for Appalachia in some odd terms. And he has since become a CNN contributor in 2017, brought on to translate the very confusing non-college educated working class in Appalachia. And just found this out today, John, that he thought about primarying Sherrod Brown in the 2018 Ohio U.S. Senate race.
Yeah, I knew about that one.
What a joke. Anyway, so JD Vance, that's who he is. He's not like someone super well known outside of this book, but Hillbilly Elegy, that's what we're talking about today, the book that he wrote. So why are we covering this? I think a lot of people who might be listening to this already know about Hillbilly Elegy. Maybe you've read it. Maybe you're pissed off about it. But if you don't know about it, it's essentially JD has written kind of his life story up until this point, growing up in an Appalachian town of Jackson, Kentucky, but also in sort of a Rust Belt town of Middletown, Ohio. We'll get into the fact that he doesn't do a great job of delineating between the two. It's becoming international bestseller, and like I mentioned before, lots of people have read it and view it as sort of, the definitive book that describes Appalachia, which is extremely problematic that we're going to talk about. It's also been used in a lot of literary courses in different high schools and college curriculum, which I find troubling as well. And it is, and I put lots of well-meaning white people read the book, which is true. Lots of book clubs like to read the book and talk about it. A lot of well-meaning white people from the coasts like to read it and talk about how misunderstood people in flyover country, as they call it, are. But the big reason why we're talking about it and why we're talking about it now is that a movie is being made about it. Now, the book came out, I want to say, was it 2015, 2016, John? Yeah, I think. So it's kind of had its like heyday. There've been a lot of responses written to it, which we're going to get into in later episodes. But it's greenlit into a movie, not just a movie. Ron Howard is directing it, which means that already it's getting a lot of Oscar buzz. It's got Glenn Close in it. It's got Amy Adams, two big headlining actresses. So this movie is going to get a lot of attention, and that's why we're talking about this particular book right now. And the movie, I think, is slated to be released on Netflix later in the year. So what we're trying to do with this not only is talk about the book and talk about the problems with the book and its harm on Appalachia, but also just like at this time now, before this movie starts to really get a lot of steam and a lot of attention, we want to make sure that we have set the record about it straight from our perspective before that comes out, because it's going to get a lot of attention when it comes out, and I think that makes it all the more relevant. We're planning on this being a 3-part series. Today we're going to be talking about the book and breaking down some of the more problematic parts of it. Next week, we will be talking about the harm that it has done to Appalachia and to the perception of the region. And then for the 3rd episode in this series, we're going to be talking about the responses to it that have already taken place and that have already been written, and how they set up the discussion for the future. So, with that being said, John, what?
Never fails.
They're just excited, man. They're like, yeah.
Well, Taylor's not here, so
they're pissed.
They're pissed.
No one to get them that puppuccino.
The what?
The puppuccino. She always posts about the puppuccino.
Oh, she's literally bringing some home now.
See, I knew it.
She's also bringing me Starbucks so I can get through this episode.
So we're going to get started, and the first thing we're going to talk about is the underlying story that's told in this book. We need to lay the foundation, and that's the way we're going to do it. John, take us through the actual story that John Dam Vance is telling.
So JD Vance starts out by telling us a little bit about himself. In current time, he wants everybody to know that he went to Yale. That's mentioned a lot. For a while, I thought that was the whole premise of the book, was just to tell us that he went to law school. Turns out it wasn't.
We can attest to it being not that special to go to law school.
It's not. And I don't know why you need to write a book about it. But anyway, so J.D. Vance essentially uses this book to tell us about his childhood, which was extremely rough, and Chuck and I both see that and understand that was something that he had to go through, and we'll talk about that as we go through some of the issues with the book. He then talks a little bit about, his mom and how she had these drug issues and was constantly going from boyfriend to boyfriend, and that really essentially messed with him because he never really had that father figure, at least not that father figure that was constantly in his life except for his grandfather. And those are kind of the two main characters, would be the grandmother and grandfather besides JD, and those were the ones that were really his parental figures and the ones that he leaned on the most to get through everything. So he takes us through childhood all the way through law school and tells us about his life story while also telling us about his perception of Appalachia.
That's a good summary of the book, and I think that when we need to draw on the specific examples, we will as we get into this. But like John mentioned, the way that the book is written is both the narrative style of him telling a story and then broader explanations about society in Appalachia and culture in Appalachia that he extrapolates from those experiences, many times with no evidence that he even talked to the people that he proclaims to know so much about, or that is really just pulling off of his own one-off experiences. And that's kind of the biggest thing about this book. John and I are going to talk through a number of things that we find problematic in here, but the biggest takeaway in our view is that JD uses personal experiences and unsubstantiated observations that he's made to make broad, sweeping accusations about an entire region of the country. And that's the biggest and most problematic part of this book. And we'll get into some of those specific examples, but a lot of times he'll take his own personal experience and use it to generalize an entire culture. And it's just, as you will find, it just is not representative of the region. Let's start with one of the first examples that he draws from, John. He talks about working at a tile distribution company prior to going to college, and talks about a guy specifically who routinely would take long bathroom breaks and played hooky to escape work.
Yeah, so essentially this guy, JD, starts out working, and of course JD does a great job. He always shows up to work on time. He's the best worker. I mean, the best worker you could ask for. Really, excellent, really a great worker. At least that's what he tells us. Now, and that's something that you'll see throughout the book, is that everybody else has issues except for JD, in terms of he admits some faults, but then also kind of exempts himself from some of these Appalachian stereotypes. We'll talk about that later. In this story specifically, there's a guy who's working at the shop with him and essentially takes these hour-long breaks to go to the bathroom and do all these other things, and finally gets fired. And when he gets fired, instead of saying, I shouldn't have been doing this, or I apologize, he then goes after the person who fires him and says, how could you do this to me? Don't you know I have a kid? And says it's really unfair to him. And then JD Vance draws a correlation between this guy's story and the rest of Appalachia. And he says, essentially, this guy is kind of the embodiment of what Appalachia is.
Which is insane that, first of all, you would take one example of a guy that you worked with at a tile company in college to extrapolate an entire opinion about a region. But again, you mentioned this is a theme that he draws from so many different times. It's like he took a notepad and wrote this down and thought, aha, this is everyone.
Yeah, and this is, I say, I know a lot of people who have really great memories, right? I may not be one of them because I forget things a lot, but there is no way in hell I would be able to tell you the exact specifications of something that happened 10, 15, 20 years ago. It's just not going to, that's not going to happen. I think some of these stories are frivolous. I don't think they're true, but he's going to obviously deny that. But he uses these stories to continue to push a narrative.
Right. And it tells a good story, right? A real juicy
great story
about, well, this is, people that aren't working hard. But what it ignores is the other people that were working in that tile distribution company that were working hard.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't talk about them.
Yeah.
Including allegedly himself. So talk about yourself too. Hey.
It's also hilarious because instead of focusing on this guy, you know what he could have focused on? The guy who owns the business, who created a good business in Appalachia.
Yep.
But he didn't. He chose to focus on the negative because JD Vance, as you read the book, you'll know is a negative guy. He's very pessimistic. He's only optimistic about himself, and that's it. And so this is, again, a running theme. He will pull the negative out of everything instead of focusing on the good. That's the type of guy he is, and that's what made money. So
why don't we move on from that example and talk about a little bit about how he describes one of the places that he lived in growing up, Jackson, Kentucky, which when you read it, it sounds like he describes it as a place that he really loved, but when you actually start getting into his examples, he just kind of talks shit about the people from there, which, say, John, he described it as a place where, quote, and these are direct quotes, by the way, quote, nobody's interested in holding down a job. One of the examples that he draws from is he was walking through a neighborhood, I think with his uncle, and this is all conversation he's having with his uncle. His uncle, by the way, whom apparently, according to the book, he doesn't talk to all that often. His uncle told him when they were walking by this house, he said, it's all full of drug addicts and one man who can find the time to make 8 children, but not the time to support them. And he said, he told me the man had no job and was proud of it. And then JD Vance took this and said that it represents much about the lives of the people in Jackson. It's kind of a shitty thing to say about the place where you grew up and you seem to admire, that nobody's interested in holding a job there and that they just were proud of that.
Yeah, again, just focusing on something. First off, who knows if this story's true because of how long ago it was, but secondly, there is so much shit talking in small communities. I mean, everywhere, not just Appalachia, but everywhere. So who knows what his uncle actually knew about this guy, or the fact that JD Vance didn't know shit about this guy.
Didn't talk to him.
He just
didn't talk to him.
He didn't talk to him. He didn't know anything about him. He used this story to create another narrative because he knew that if he would use this narrative and he would piss enough people off, it would get more people to buy the book and he'd be a New York Times bestseller. That was his only goal here.
This is like taking high school gossip, then writing it into a book that you're going to teach people about high school for. It's stupid. And it's also just like, I mean, of course it's offensive. Like, you take an example that may or may not even be true and use it to describe an entire town where you have a lot of roots in. Like, that's, I don't know, that's it seems very disrespectful to the people of Jackson, number one. One of the other things he said about this too, which just I think irks me a lot, is that he was talking broadly, I believe, about the people of Jackson. He said the people are physically unhealthy, and without government assistance, they lack treatment for the most basic problems. Most important, they're mean about it. They will hesitate to open their lives up to others for the simple reason that they don't want to be judged. Well, I won't get into the irony of that statement of coming from the guy who walks by people's houses and judges the people within there, not even talking to them, but this is just, again, like he is taking these destructive stereotypes of Appalachia and giving life and breathing life into them.
And it's not true. I mean, yes, there are people that...
yeah, that's important to say too. It's not true.
There are people that embody this. They are everywhere. He took, and this is what I think most people should know about this. He took something that was happening in the country and correlated it to a region and said, "Oh, it's only happening here," and that's not true. It was happening all over the country at that time. It's happening all over the country now, where I can pick and choose anything I want to say negative about a certain area and then correlate it to that area. I could say things about Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles. It's not that hard. And so what he did was he was able to pick and choose the things that he wanted to mention, and this is one of them. I mean, and he wants to, and I'm glad you mentioned the irony behind this. He wants to talk about people, quote unquote, being mean. This dude made he made millions of dollars being mean. That was literally that's all this book is. And
yeah, it's like the burn book from Mean Girls.
Exactly. And let me tell you this, Appalachians, honestly, we don't give a shit about JD Vance, and we don't give a shit that he was mean. We give a shit because of the problems that this book has created.
Yeah, and look, just as JD Vance does not speak for all Appalachians, neither do we. Also, we're not putting ourselves out there as if we do, unlike him. But like, this is important because so many people take what he is saying as gospel. That's what's so problematic about this. It's not that it's like JD Vance spewing some bullshit. Like, if he put this in a string of tweets, he'd just be, one of 10 million other people that did that. But he's made a boatload of money off this book. It's getting made into a movie. It's going to get a lot more attention, and people are going to continue to look at this like they did after the 2016 election, when you had a bunch of people from California and New York airdrop into different parts of Appalachia with a notepad and a pencil, like wanting to talk to the real Americans. And so he's sort of their false prophet in that sense. And it's just like, it's, again, like another poor example of somebody who purports to know about the region, but then reinforces the harmful stereotypes that have hurt the region for so long. And this is just one of many examples of it.
Yeah, and I actually have a story about this. When I had mentioned to one of my coworkers that we were covering Hillbilly Elegy, and at that time I was re-listening to the book, she had told me that she loved the book and that she had listened to it before she moved to Appalachia, and found that essentially she thought what he was talking about was true. So we had about an hour conversation on why a lot of the shit that he says is complete horseshit. Was able to break down any false narrative that she had learned from this book. But the point is that if she had not talked to me about it, she would have continued to think that way. That's why this book is trouble. That's why this movie will be huge trouble for the region.
He doesn't just talk about people in Jackson. He talks about the people he describes as hillbillies in general, which it's kind of like a loosely defined term, but we're just going to say that it's people in the region where he was from, and Appalachia as a whole, because that by context seems to be the case. This is, again, like just an example of where in my opinion, he reiterates just like your quintessential Republican talking points throughout this entire book about laziness and like just abusing the welfare system. And so one thing that he says, and this is just when he's talking about people in general, he says, avoidance and wishful thinking are forms of coping that hillbillies learn to deal with uncomfortable truths by avoiding them or pretending better truths exist. And it makes it hard to look at themselves honestly. Okay, talk about the armchair psychologist here. All right, so I thought that he went to law school. But here, he's acting like he is just like some psychiatrist who's diagnosed this great problem of hillbillies. They all just are avoiding things and operate on wishful thinking.
You're exactly right. And one of the funniest things about him passing judgment on people is that during the second chapter, he actually says, I don't equate poverty to laziness, but poverty is occurring because of laziness. And these are the things that he says because he thinks them. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. Like, this is a guy who has ideals currently that think this way. And obviously this book resembles that. And
yeah, that's like saying the whole, I'm not racist, but.
Yeah, exactly. He is always about trying to position himself, because let's be frank, this guy knew, or at least knows, that he wants to get into politics. And so he doesn't want to put himself in a box. So he always tries to work his way around it. He's bad at it. He's really bad at it. But he certainly tries.
He's bad at it, but one of the problems is that a lot of people who read this and talk about it don't dig beyond the surface level. And that's where he is put to an advantage, and that's what we're trying to get at here. One thing that is more of a broad topic that we've alluded to a little bit, and we want to kind of dive into it, is this notion that he equates receiving welfare, receiving public assistance in any form, as being like akin to laziness. And this is something I know is personal for John, and it's personal to me in the sense that it just is such a false assumption in so many ways, and it's one of the stereotypes that I think has been the most harmful to Appalachia. We'll get into that in the next episode, but to give a little bit of context to this, when he's talking about Appalachia, he's like, Appalachia's people are hardworking, except, of course, for the many food stamp recipients who show little interest in hard work. And he had a neighbor that he references in the book. He said he had a neighbor that was a lifetime welfare recipient, would talk about industriousness, and build a construct in her head of not being a moocher. Wow. So if I'm his neighbor, I'm going to feel like shit after reading this. And, we don't know. Maybe his neighbor was abusing the welfare system. Maybe that's the case. That's entirely possible. But, again, as we go back to it, you can't assume something as fact based on a one-off experience and an anecdotal evidence. Like, he's essentially calling all food stamp recipients lazy.
Exactly. And this is a guy, and we'll talk about how he really was, his real upbringing and things like that, but this is a guy who never had to worry about being on welfare, because he always had his grandparents, and his grandparents were pretty well off, and we can talk about that. But this guy never had to worry about these things. Like, he did have a rough childhood. His mom was all over the place. She was addicted to drugs. His father wasn't there. And I think the thing that makes me the most mad about JD Vance is that his story and my story are very similar. Both of us grew up without our fathers, which obviously is a shame. It's something that you hope that others don't have to go through. But there's a big difference between JD Vance and I, and that's the fact that JD Vance, when he looked around, he said that he saw several families that looked like his, but in actuality, that wasn't the case. I mean, at least for me, I always kind of looked at other families in Appalachia and thought, why can't my family be like that? It's obviously a different perspective than what JD went through, which is, again, why I think that there may be an underlying issue with why JD thinks the way he does about Appalachia. But in general, for me at least, there were families like mine, but it wasn't on every corner. It wasn't in every classroom. It was a ton of loving families, huge families, but my family wasn't like that. And I kind of always thought, why not me? So it's interesting to hear him say that it was, his family's, essentially a picture of all of Appalachia, because I disagree with that, and I didn't see it when I was growing up, at least. One key thing to point out here is that when Vance discusses poverty and quote-unquote welfare queens, he doesn't even provide you with statistics, and second, wants to blame Appalachia and make it perceive like Appalachia is filled with quote-unquote welfare queens. But if you actually look at the statistics, in 2011, for instance, the Medicare Fraud Control Units, which investigate and prosecute fraud, found that the top 3 states with Medicaid fraud were California, Texas, and New York. None in Appalachia. But he doesn't mention that to you. He mentions only things that he wants you to know. Another key thing to remember here is that welfare recipients are not living a lavish lifestyle. They're not doing these things to make money as he wants to perceive it. Sure, there are some people that commit welfare fraud. We know that it happens. But let me break this down for you. Compared to the average American household, welfare recipients spend far less money on food consumptions, entertainment, and even healthcare cost. In fact, Families receiving welfare spend 154% less on entertainment and 123% less on healthcare costs. That is not this lavish lifestyle, and is not this goal to be oriented to that Vance wants people to think Appalachians are essentially striving to be. It's not true, and unfortunately, he wants to portray this in the book itself without actually providing any statistics, and that's why it's extremely dangerous. Vance will also try to essentially convince you that if you're poor, you're lazy. He says he doesn't correlate it to that, but he does several times throughout the book. Things that Vance forgets to mention when he talks about how poor people essentially are lazy, and this is something that he is constantly referring to, even though he says that he's not, he forgets that in Appalachia, 1, jobs are scarce, especially professional jobs, and 2, the jobs that people have don't pay well. In fact, in 2017, the number 1 and number 2 employment opportunities for Appalachians were food, lodging, and entertainment, and retail trade. Those accounted for 26% of jobs. Think about that. Several of those jobs pay minimum wage or barely above it. If you want to continue to blame the poor, you're in the wrong area, because it's not that people aren't working or they're refusing to work. It's the fact that good paying jobs have not come to Appalachia in mass quantities like other areas have. It's just not happening. Vance doesn't mention this. He doesn't talk about essentially how people struggle because of the jobs that are available. Remember, Appalachia at one time was a strong manufacturing area, but with the decline of coal and manufacturing, jobs are scarce, and the jobs that are coming in are retail trade. It doesn't pay a lot of money. People don't want to be dependent on the system. It's something that happens. JD Vance, again, forgets the important statistics that actually plague Appalachia. I think the biggest thing that JD Vance misses is the fact that not every place in Appalachia is the same. He compares Jackson and Middletown and essentially points out a couple differences, but equates both to the same type of terrible stereotypes that he has claimed to have fought against, but has only actually continued it. But a good example of this is actually the poverty rate in Appalachia. So, for example, in Virginia in 2014, the statewide poverty rate was 11.5%. The rest of Appalachia was 18.8%. This is totally different than the worst state in the region, which was Kentucky at 25.4%. It was even higher than the region. Every single place in Appalachia deals with different problems, some worse, some better, and to be able to group them all together is impossible. Appalachia is a unique region for a reason, and you can't group it all together. Essentially, I mean, you cannot make an assumption about Jackson, Kentucky, and then say it's the same in Middletown, Ohio, or Parkersburg, West Virginia, or Nashville, or wherever. It just isn't true. And that, I think, is the biggest miss of all in this book.
When you have somebody who writes an entire book about their life growing up and the experiences they had in the places they grew up in, but then is so dismissive and so disrespectful to the people that are from the same place where he grew up, he paints this picture as if he's the only person that came out of Middletown or that came out of Jackson that made it anything in their lives. One of the things he said was, people talk about, this is a quote, people talk about hard work all the time in places like Middletown. You can walk through a town where 30% of the young men work fewer than 20 hours a week and find not a single person aware of his own laziness. Well, first of all, I truly don't understand how this was up to snuff with publishers, because I don't know where you can pull that stat out of your ass, but this is just so dismissive of people from there. I can tell you this, and again, look, I know we're hitting on anecdotal examples, but this is an anecdotal example here, and I think that a lot of people will identify with it. There are lazy people. There are certainly, like, I've worked with some that are, but the majority of the people that I've worked with, both in like manual labor jobs and otherwise, are hardworking people that are well-meaning in Appalachia and otherwise. And that's been the case with almost everybody I know. But the thing that happens is the lazy person often is the one that sticks out, and that's the one that you remember.
There's an issue with, I would like to know what the underlying problem is with JD Vance. There's got to be something more to why he is angry at Appalachia. I think he is. I think he is angry at Appalachia. He pretends that he's not, but you don't write a book like this and have such a pessimistic view. And I mean, literally, there's nothing, he doesn't mention positives about these people. I mean, he sees only the negative, except for his grandparents. I mean, he does see positive in them, but of course it's his grandparents. So there has to be some underlying resentment for something.
I think you're right. I think it really shows that there's, like, I mean, this entire book is a projection of something, not entirely sure what. You've got all this built up animosity about a place where you grew up and where you purport to really care about, but then you just don't. It's like he found success, and as a way of saying thank you, he writes this book to dunk on the entire region, makes a couple mil off of it, and just like rides the coattails of his own success and is high off of his own ego.
If I ever did this and wrote a book, first off, Chuck, if I ever do this, just beat the shit out of me. And secondly, you probably wouldn't have to, because my mom would. I mean, for me to go back on a community that helped me, she would whip my ass. And the fact that this guy has been able to get away with this is, it's insulting, obviously, but it kind of makes me question, like, where is everyone else in his family? I want to hear from them. Like, what do they think? Because I think it would be an interesting case study to see what they think about this book, whether or not they think it's true or whether or not they, relate to his feelings. I'd like to know. I think it would be interesting.
I think that actually rolls in really nicely into a separate section that we really wanted to get into, which is that, like, the experience that he points out and, like, just his takeaways about this culture that he says is in crisis. His experience in many ways conflicts with the reality for many, and particularly what we're getting at is from like a socioeconomic perspective. And that's not to say that he was like wealthy and rolling in the dough. When he kind of has conflicting statements, really. He talks about his family being poor, but at one point in the book he said, quote, "We had plenty of money. My mom had a nursing license, etc." And he referred to themselves as a rural Ohio family with an income of over $100,000. Now, I believe at the time in the book that he was referencing, that was 1993, John. So I did a little bit of an inflation adjustment for that and calculated that would be the equivalent of $179,000 today. Now, look, you can get into a lot of metrics about, how far that dollar goes now and then, but I'll tell you, rural Ohio, 100 grand back then, that's not bad. I can tell you that, and I can tell you that it's a lot more money than most families had, and it's a lot more money than most families have now. And so to take these experiences and paint with a broad brush, especially shitting on welfare recipients and saying that they're lazy. Meanwhile, you come from a family of purported privilege of making over $100,000 a year. Like, in what world do you think that you can relate to those people? In what world do you think that is something that, like, you can identify with?
Yeah, and I think you hinted at this. Middletown, first off, many would argue it's not Appalachia. Let's get that out of the way. There's a lot of argument on that. Secondly, Middletown does not look like most of Appalachia. It's a town of 50,000 people. It's a little bit more well off. Yeah, it has its issues, but it's a little bit more well off than a lot of places. They have a higher income, a higher median income. But the big thing that he talks about with, I think we didn't mention this, his grandparents moved from Jackson to Middletown, and they never felt like they quite fit in Middletown, which makes me question, if every place in Appalachia is the same, like JD Vance says, how did his grandparents not feel like they fit in? and it's either two different things. He's in a double bind. It's either one, Middletown is in Appalachia, and he doesn't actually know about the place that he's writing about, or two, Middletown is Appalachia, and every place in Appalachia is different. It's not the same. You can't make assumptions. So there's so many holes in this book and in this thought process that I'm glad we're focusing on it, and I'm glad we're pointing it out. And I think that this is something that a lot of people need to do, and a lot of educators. If you're an educator out there and you're listening right now and you use this book, take it off your curriculum. It's not what you want to teach.
In addition to the income level that I think would probably fall well outside of the scope of the average person where he was from, John, if you recall, he also referenced a lot of other things that I think people who don't grow up with means don't have the opportunity to do when they're growing up, including he visited his uncle in Napa, California to, quote, understand identity. He did mention, I'll give him this, he did mention that his other friends were amazed that he was able to afford the airfare for that, which I think, again, tells you something about, his experience versus, the typical experience, I think. And then he also attended therapy sessions as a kid, both with and without his mom, which is great. Definitely not discouraging that. In fact, I highly encourage it. But I think that from a resource standpoint and from an insurance standpoint, a lot of people don't have the opportunity to have therapy sessions and are able to go there and work out some of the more complexities that they have growing up. And so I think, again, that lends itself to this false notion that JD Vance understands the experience of people that grew up around him, but yet he's purporting to and passing judgment on them.
For people like JD Vance, they may come from Appalachia, but they didn't have the same upbringing as most people. And for him to look at these people, and this is his thought. I mean, the way that he grew up is how he was, how he acts today. And for him, he looks at these people and he says, well, how come you can't get over your shit, but I can? And that's his point. But again, you just mentioned it. He was able to get out of the region when he wanted to. He was able to see a therapist. If a lot of Appalachians had the ability and had the resources to see therapists, it would...
And the access.
Yeah, in the access. Think about all these rural communities right now where all these hospitals are shutting down. The ability for people to have access in Appalachia to a therapist, let alone, a hospital, it's becoming even less than what it was in that time. And it's going to continue to dwindle, I think. But imagine people actually having access to do these things. We would probably have a lot less of these quote unquote resentful people that he talks about. They didn't get the same opportunities he did. And I think that that's something that he's missing.
Another thing to add to this whole money aspect of and socioeconomic aspect of his experiences, John, you're not going to see in the headlines of Hillbilly Elegy about him defending payday lending, but he definitely defends payday lending in this book. I'll tell you.
Yeah, yes, he does.
Which is just, again, I think tells you all you need to know about this dude. He talks about, I believe it was when he was working for a state senator or the Ohio State House, and how the guy he was working for was one of the only people to vote against this payday lending bill or something, and there's certain problems with the bill that they pointed out, but in general, it regulated payday lenders, and he just thought that this was so crazy, and he took a payday loan out once and paid it back with a very small, modest amount of interest and was fine, and it was because he didn't qualify for credit or something like that. And I'm sitting here thinking, this is so fucking dangerous. This guy is getting up here defending one of the institutions that keeps people poor, that keeps Appalachians poor. Payday lending. You're going to get up here. You're going to write this goddamn piece of dog shit book. And you're going to cap it off by saying, well, I just think payday lending is wonderful, and people don't really understand the benefit of it. Let me tell you something. You don't understand the fucking detriment of it. When you've got interest rates out the ass, 400, 500, 600%.
Yeah, and look, it only took one subject to get Chuck fired up. And that's what this book does. I mean, I think that that's a great personification of it. But, and when it comes to payday loans, I get what he's saying to a point. Don't kill me, Chuck. I think he says, look, it's a way for people to put food on the table if they don't have money and yada, yada, yada. We get that. But the regulation that his senator would vote against would be to at least make the situation better. And for him to say, like, that he paid it off with this modest amount of interest, one, if he did, he's lucky. And two, whether or not that story's true, we'll never know. And so, but there are plenty of people that we can use real facts on, real statistics, and show that payday lending leads to Appalachians still being poor and makes them remain poor. And JD Vance may have one story that he thinks proves that wrong, but he is so dead wrong.
Yeah. He's like, well, my experience was that I was able to pay it off quickly with modest interest. So that experience is obviously the experience that everybody has.
Oh, yeah.
It's not, and the thing that pissed me off was we actually talked about this in the last episode, Bernie Sanders' Appalachia. Go and listen to it if you haven't already. But one thing we did talk about is access to banking and access to credit. And that is a good point that JD Vance almost makes. He almost gets there, John. He gets right up to the edge.
He almost
gets right up the edge, but then he shits the bed. And he shits the bed in this way, John, because he scoffs at the idea that these could be predatory. And that is just factually inaccurate. It's wrong. It's damaging. It's hurtful. And anybody that's reading this fucking book needs to close it, throw it in a goddamn fire, and just read something else.
Pick up the Bible.
Pick up Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone.
Because that's more of a nonfiction book than this.
Anyway, that's my whole rant about that. And last thing I'll say on the finances part is he said he basically went to Yale for free and didn't really have to take out any loans. So, yeah, come back to me again when you understand the student loan issue, JD, because I would be willing to venture a guess that the majority of Appalachians have student debt that have actually gone to college. Oh, and he does dunk on community colleges, by the way. I won't get into that. But one thing, John, I did want to dial back on real quick, because you did mention that this guy has an interest in politics. And that is true. As we mentioned, he was thinking about primarying Sherrod Brown, and he got a lot of good reception, as he said. A lot of good reception. Didn't do it, but a lot of good reception. Well, number one, the reason why he didn't do it is because he would have got his fucking ass kicked by Sherrod Brown, who's a legitimate goddamn American and Ohioan. But the other thing is that he doesn't have his politics right. He keeps citing, like, multiple times, John. Multiple times. He goes back and he's like, well, Republicans really took over Appalachia after Nixon. And again, I'm not going to get into, like, the context of the discussion. I just really need to point this out. That is absolutely incontrovertibly untrue. I mean, you want to look at it from a broad base. Look at the 1992 presidential election, where Democrats took Tennessee, Georgia, Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, or even before that. But after Nixon, John, 1976, Jimmy Carter swept the entire South and all Appalachian states except for Virginia. And even up until 2004, Tennessee, red as hell Tennessee, had a Democratic trifecta as recently as, I believe, 2004. West Virginia had a trifecta, which means that they had the same party had the governorship in both chambers of the legislature up to 2013. Democrats had it up to 2013. So this is just yet another fact that he gets wrong. And it's not a hugely consequential one in the book, really, but it's just goes to show you that he has no clue what he's talking about.
Yeah, and again, it's probably because he looks at a subset of people and hears them at that time, after Nixon, talk about, let's say conservative politics when he's growing up, and thinks that that's how everybody else thinks. And that's what this book is about. It's constantly, one person told me this, so it has to be true. This guy, he must love Wikipedia. Because, I mean, it's just one place where he can read something and automatically think it's true. I mean, he's at a point, I would hate to be his professor, because he'd have one source for everything. He didn't need multiple sources.
John, it'd be a shame if somebody who was listening to this went on to JD Vance's Wikipedia page and changed some of the facts on there, but we're not encouraging that at all. We're not encouraging that. But I want to just to kind of put a button on the politics thing, John, I'm I'm gonna pretend to be JD Vance here, giving a stump speech for you, and you tell me how you think this might be received in Ohio. Okay.
Okay.
All right, let me just pretend like I'm addressing a crowd here. I'm JD Vance, and I come up and hi, my name's JD Vance. I'm an Appalachian, and I'm running for United States Senate Ohio because I think that you all are lazy and you need to stop using welfare and just try harder at your job and not take so many bathroom breaks.
I like the fake country accent because that's what he'd have to put on.
Yeah. What do you think?
Yeah,
I mean, do you think people would bite for that?
Home run.
Home run, right. Yeah, knock it out of the park. Definitely would win that.
And that's kind of my thing too, is like, to me, if I'm from Ohio, I mean, I'm from West Virginia, which is obviously I live 5 minutes from Ohio.
West by God.
But if I'm from Ohio and I know that he wrote this book and he runs to be my senator, why the hell would I ever vote for him? This is a guy who doesn't think shit of me. He thinks that I am the lowest of the low. If JD Vance runs in Ohio, I will do everything in my power to have him not win. I mean, and I'll go to Ohio as much as I have to, because it's ridiculous that this guy thinks that he should be a U.S. senator for a state that he shit on. This would be like him going to Jackson and being like, well, time to run for city council.
Well, John, I think if he does run, I don't know if he's really going to need much help from you in order to discredit himself. If he just opens his mouth and says any of the shit that's in his book, then he's toast.
Well, and what is he going to do? Like, is he going to go back and be like, well, that was a different time? You know, he can't. I mean, to me, this book should cripple any political movement he has.
I hope it does. I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that it does. Because he doesn't have any business running for public office if this is how he views the people that he purportedly knows best.
Insane.
And it is insane. Anyway, let's maybe wrap up the discussion on Hillbilly Elegy. I think we hit on a lot of the main criticisms that we have for it. And again, we're going to be doing 2 more episodes on this that kind of breaks down things a little bit more further. But John, takeaways here is that JD Vance just, like, he uses, like, his one-off experiences to basically inform his opinion on an entire region, an entire subset of people, and entire towns in such an ignorant way, and one that is just like a shameful representation of Appalachia. And I think it's harmful. It's very harmful.
It definitely is. And for the people who think like, oh man, because I mean, there were some people who thought we shouldn't cover this and gave it bad press or whatever, or was giving him, more notoriety. First off, we're just a rinky-dink podcast, right?
Whoa.
Let's not, we are a highly. You know what? You're right. We shouldn't have done this because we're fucking. We are just massive. No, but the truth is that we're not the ones who are actually giving him notoriety. It's the people who thought that this should be made into a movie. I mean, Netflix is going to put this out for the world to see. And if people don't talk about it and they don't tell people that this isn't true, this will cripple the region even more than it is right now, because people are going to think that these stereotypes, I mean, we are just now trying to move past it, and this is going to bring all of them back.
Netflix is still going to do the movie. So yeah, either we can provide more voices on this that are pushing back, or we don't. Exactly. That's what it is. Yeah, so that was Hillbilly Elegy. We hope that you take away something from this, and that takeaway is that it's a dumpster fire. Don't read it. Don't give it any money. And when you hear your friends talk about it, tell them the truth. But with that, John, do you have a beef this week?
Look, I know that I promised our listeners that I would always do a beef with Big John, but I pretty much think that this whole episode is a beef with Big John and medium-sized Chuck. So I don't think that we
Thank you for that. Thank you for that honor.
Well, I mean, I don't want to call you small, but I'd say you're medium-sized, right? Okay, for all you listeners at home, Chuck is medium-sized. Anyway, I don't think that we need to do a beef this time. I think JD Vance has taken enough of the heat, and I don't want to get super negative on the podcast. Plus, I think that we should open up to listeners. Tell me your beef this week. You can use our Instagram, our Twitter. You can tweet, or hold on, you could tweet at us. You could comment on our Instagram. You could comment on our Facebook. Let us know what your beef is this week, and we'll talk about it next week. That's how we'll do interaction.
Yeah, and you know what? To end it this week, let's end it on a positive note. Go to Yasin's Falafel House if you find yourself in Knoxville, Tennessee. Support a great small business. And with that, John, we're going to close it out. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, MySpace, Friendster. Follow us at Zanga. Go outside and follow the signs. We do geocaching, all those things. Shoot us an email at appodlachia@gmail.com and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, anywhere you find your podcast, and leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing. And we'll be back with you next week.